my talk's called How Much Money is Failure Going to Cost You? I've been in the game industry about 15 years. I've worked on lots of games. I started off as a QA tester at Acclaim in 1999. I was a level designer and then a game designer, then a lead designer. Then I ended up running projects and studios, and my most recent job was as head of European studios for a big company called DeNA. And I'm now an independent consultant. And you can check out my website, bencousins.com, if you're interested. So a lot of those games I've worked on have been successful, but a lot of them have also been failures. And today I'm going to talk about failure. The majority of games are not profitable, especially in this modern world where we've got this proliferation of content. There's 1 million iOS apps. There's 1.2 million Android apps. And there's 10 million Facebook apps. Never mind the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of games on PC, on console, and on browser. And we all know that the vast majority of the revenue and of the profit is concentrated on a very small proportion of those products. So the vast, vast majority of games in the modern world are failures. So this is why it's important to concentrate on failure, I think. And I believe that games aren't successful because they don't resonate with consumers. What I mean by that is resonance is kind of an opinion that you make in just a few seconds or a few minutes of playing a game. Like Columbo, our consumers operate on a gut reaction. They react very rapidly to a product or to an experience and make their decisions about whether they like it or not very, very quickly. And we didn't really know this until we started to analyze consumer data on a large scale with digital games. And we can see how rapidly people make their mind up and people stop playing games in the digital age. Most games actually fail in seconds or in minutes. And when you fail in the traditional kind of pay-before-you-play world, you'll create a game that doesn't resonate. It will get poor reviews. Reviewers make their minds up, whether they're the public reviewing the game or whether they're professional reviewers. They will make their mind up about a game very rapidly. And also, you know, it's very easy to quickly play a game, generate an opinion based on that product that doesn't resonate with you, and then to go on social media nowadays and to complain about it. I think we've all seen very rapidly how the Elder Scrolls Online has been a victim of a very poor social media reaction. And that's a great example, I think, recent example. Your game might resonate so badly that even a flashy trailer for your PlayStation game doesn't make an impact on users. In the modern world of free-to-play, resonance is very important because if consumers don't rapidly become excited by the product that they're playing, they simply won't come back. And as you know, in free-to-play games, if people don't come back, if your game doesn't retain users, you simply won't make any money at all. So we've got this world where there's a lot of content available, and it's very, very easy to abandon a game and to jump onto the next thing very quickly. So how do you avoid making products that don't resonate? I used to work in market research in my 20s. I worked in a market research call center, and there were 2 pay grades. If you completed a certain number of surveys an hour, you got a higher pay grade than other people. And I tried to work really hard to optimize my time to get more completed surveys and get this higher pay rate. First, I tried to focus on quality. I talked to each person really carefully that I was talking to on the phone. I would try and cajole them. I'd try and flatter them. I'd try and persuade them to try and find out if I could get them to persuade them to take part in the survey. And I just realized that some people don't want to do surveys. Intrinsically, they're not interested in that process. However hard you try, they will never accept. So I changed my tactics, and I started moving through the phone numbers as fast as I possibly could, getting to the point in my patter as fast as possible, and I found that I was able to get a lot more surveys completed. The reality of the situation was, in this vast population of people that I was ringing on a daily basis in this job, there were certain people out there that just liked to do market research surveys. And if all I needed to do was rapidly move through the numbers and try and find those people, and then I was able to complete more surveys. So it worked much better to fail fast and rapidly find those successes rather than to spend a lot of time on each individual piece of sample to try and persuade them to become a success. And the analogy I would make is it was more like diamond mining than sculpture. If you think about what sculptors do, they spend days or weeks or even years creating something valuable out of a single piece of rock. But sometimes that sculpture cracks. Sometimes it doesn't turn out how they expected, and sometimes the client isn't interested in it once they've produced it. What diamond miners do is they try to make the same value from processing rock, but they search for the diamonds hidden in that rock. And the faster and cheaper that they can get through that waste rock to find those diamonds, the cheaper they find that value. Miners kind of admit that they're not in control, that they're in a process of discovering rather than creating. So how do miners and telephone market researchers avoid failure? Well, they actually embrace failure as part of the process. And when you start to look at what really smart people have said about failure, smart and successful people, you start to see a pattern emerging. This is Edward de Bono, who invented the concept of lateral thinking, and he's a very influential creative thinker. It's better to have enough ideas for some of them to be wrong than to be always right by having no ideas at all. Wayne Gretzky actually puts it a little bit more succinctly. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Keep taking shots, some of them will hit the goal. Churchill talks about the enthusiasm that you need to retain in this process. Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. This is Andrew Stanton, who's a director of WALL-E and Finding Nemo, and he talks about Pixar's process in a new book about the company. My strategy is always be wrong as fast as we can. So we look at Pixar's games as these highly polished, kind of perfect creations. They're the result of years and years of failure on an industrial scale. The best quote is from Coco Chanel. Don't spend time beating on a wall hoping to transform it into a door. You're not going to get through that wall. So spend your energies on finding a door rather than trying to turn that wall into a door. Supercell, one of the most successful games companies of recent years, they will drink a beer when they have a successful product, but they'll drink champagne when their products fail. There's a focus on failure and celebrating failure and making that part of the process, which leads them to their successes. So let's see what one of the most influential thinkers of the technology world of the last 20 years has got to say about failure. If I can just have the audio up here.
Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people that just dream about them. You gotta act. And you've got to be willing to fail. You've got to be willing to crash and burn. You know, with people on the phone, with starting a company, with whatever. If you're afraid of failing, you won't get very far.
I love that kind of shrug he does at the end. I can imagine him kind of saying, "You suck, you're fired," in a similar manner. So when you look into people who've been successful, they kind of have an obsession or an interest in failure. And they also have a lack of fear of failure. And that's an interesting kind of thing to discover. So why am I interested in failure, and why am I talking about failing? I believe as a business person, you should always be interested in anything for which the price is dropping. You're looking for bargains in that kind of cost/revenue calculation. And there's a good chance that if you spotted a bargain before your competitors, that you can get a jump on them. You can either produce a competitive product at a lower price, or you can get a better margin than them. And I believe that the price of failing in the games industry is dropping very, very quickly. But what do you mean by the costs of failure are dropping? You know, get to the point, cousins, you're being pretentious. Specifically, what do I mean by this point of failure? It's actually about the cost of simulation. So the Air Force spends money on training a pilot to a testable level of completeness. And then they spend money on building a simulator that represents the real world to an effective degree. And at that point, they put those two things together. And if the subject succeeds in the simulation, they invest more money on completing the production of that pilot. Does anyone know what that is? Any guesses? That's an arse simulator, or an ass simulator, depending where you're on. This is used by the furniture testing industry to test the usage of furniture. That piece of plastic is attached to a machine which simulates people sitting and standing up from a chair thousands and thousands of times. So the furniture industry spend money on building a chair to a testable level of completeness, and then they spend money building a simulator that represents the real world, in this case someone's backside, to an effective degree, and then they can test the potential of that chair, which gives them an opportunity to invest money in completing that product. So what I mean by the costs of failure are dropping is that in the games industry, the costs of these two things are dropping. Building a game to a testable level of completeness is cheaper now than it ever has been. And building a simulator that represents the real world to an effective degree, and effective is the key word here, This is also dropping in price extremely rapidly. People desperate to exit the world of packaged goods. All of the major publishers of the packaged goods industry are desperate to try and find a way out of this business. And the main reason for that is that the cost of failure is very high in this business. Building both testable products and effective simulators is high. And effective, remember, is the important point here. The most significant cost is the simulator part. Simulators in the world of packaged goods are extraordinarily expensive. Experience tells me that good games succeed or fail based on gut reaction, that resonance that I talked about. But that resonance is generally to a core mechanic of some time. And experience also tells me that no amount of polish will add fun to a core mechanic if it isn't intrinsically fun in itself. And this is exactly the reason why simple mobile games can become some of the most popular entertainment products in the world. These two products, Angry Birds and Flappy Bird, didn't need very much polish at all because the intrinsic mechanics of them are extremely resonant. So you can build a testable product, I believe, with a very, very small proportion of your final budget. I believe between 1% and 5% of your budget can get a testable version of your product, which is representative enough. The problem is in the packaged goods era that the cost of getting that cheaply produced prototype to a representative and statistically significant audience, which would be about 5,000 to 10,000 people in my opinion, is extremely high because you've got to manufacture and distribute discs to all of those people. But then there's a very, very high cost of researching and analyzing the reaction of those consumers to that prototype. So the world of packaged goods actually has to rely on very different simulations, which are much less accurate. This is one of the simulators they use. Employees who are considered experts in predicting consumer behavior. So we've all come across them. These are development or marketing executives, rockstar game designers or project leads who claim to be able to predict or create a hit. Now, sometimes that works, but these people are very, very rare. They're extremely expensive, but they're also not very accurate in general. It's very easy for these people to pull the wool over your eyes and to blame other people for failure when one of their ideas or one of their predictions doesn't work. So that's not a very effective simulator. Another thing that traditional games companies do is they commission mock reviews from journalists. The problem with this is that journalists are excellent at predicting critical successes, but not very good at predicting commercial successes. And those two things are often different. Another technique that's used is running playtests. You invite 10 or 15 people from the local area to come to your company, give them some pizza, sit them down in front of the game, and then ask their opinions on it later. The problem with this is that the sample size is often too small. People don't act in an honest manner in this circumstance. And also, it's an artificial environment that they're experiencing the product in. Now, because of tradition, many of these old companies are still using these old-fashioned and inaccurate methods of consumer simulation. And this is why it's so expensive for them to find hits and why we often have expensive misses. Maybe Titanfall is the most recent miss. Certainly, no one's talking about the sales figures for it, which is a bad sign. The internet, though, represented by this data center, has massively reduced the cost of distributing those testable games and collecting usage data for them. So the cost of creating this accurate simulation has dropped massively. And we understand these simulations as being the modern concept of a beta test or of a soft launch or of an early access game. This is kind of a new concept of charging people for early access to a product. And this is currently considered the best practice amongst the mainstream of the industry. But I believe that these games are too complete. These aren't, generally you don't launch a soft launch or a beta or an early access after spending 1% to 5% of your budget. Maybe 50% or more of your budget has been spent at that point. I actually believe that you could test using the same methodology, a much earlier product, a much simpler prototype, because we can be certain that people's core reaction to a core gameplay mechanic is what means you're a success or a failure. So these companies doing this kind of stuff might feel really proud of themselves, but they're actually not being aggressive enough. Who's got the best practices in the industry at the moment? Anyone recognize this game? Now, if in your head you're saying Candy Crush Saga, you're wrong. That isn't Candy Crush Saga. That's Candy Crush. Candy Crush is the first version of this product, which was tested on royalgames.com, King's destination browser-based website. And on royalgames.com, there are 100 games. So we think of King as being a one-game company. They're actually a 100-game company. And what King do with their products is they produce very cheaply produced prototype games. They put them on royalgames.com, and they have a very good quality analytics suite which will tell them whether people are coming back and playing these games and whether they're engaging with them. And from the hits on royalgames.com, the very cheaply produced hits, the ones with good retention, based on that core mechanic that they've created, will go over to Facebook, and they'll get the saga treatment. They'll get more levels, they'll get a progression system, they'll get social features, they'll get a story, they'll get polish, they'll get monetization, and they'll get a period of being tweaked and a period of being tuned. And only the games that succeed or that perform the very best on Facebook go over to mobile, where the acquisition costs are higher, but also the revenues are higher, where you have to make a massive bit. This is where you get to spending $1 million a day on marketing. So King are probably the big company that fail the cheapest. They get 100 failures to find $1 billion blockbuster. But I still think they're spending too much money on that initial phase. And I'm going to finish just by spending a couple of minutes talking about an even cheaper way of doing this, a potential way of building a $1 billion games business with a full-time staff of less than 20 people. And the best way to describe this is with a graph. The vertical axis is people, and each one of those blocks represents a person. And the horizontal axis is time. So we're looking at the lifetime of a product and the people that are assigned to that product over time. And if you look at the very, very far end, there's actually nobody assigned to this product. So how on earth do you make a prototype game without assigning any staff to a product? You ask the public to submit prototypes. So let's imagine that Nintendo create a new push in their business to find new hits. And they encourage people to submit their own prototype games. These don't need to be a lot of time spent on them. Think about a game jam. This is just a few hours or a day's work. Create your prototype in Unreal and Unity and submit it to this theoretical company. There's still less than one person assigned to each game. It then goes through a rapid pre-screening process to make sure that it's not infringing on anyone's IP, to make sure that it's not offensive, and to make sure that it functions. So, let's think about 2 or 3 people running through these hundreds or thousands of applicants. You then create a destination website or destination app which features all of these submitted prototypes and which jiggles them in a random way so that you get a good sample. We only need 5,000 to 10,000 people to test each prototype. And what we're trying to do here is to see which of these prototypes is most sticky. Which ones do people play for the longest? Which ones do people come back to and play the next day? So we're basically creating our simulation by analytically measuring the consumer's reaction to these publicly submitted prototypes in a destination app. Your fail point, you've probably spent $2,000 or $3,000 per title at this point. And you can be pretty certain, because you'll see the data for all of these products. Imagine all the top products will be laid out and you'll have a retention on the vertical axis. You'll see spikes. Certain games will be engaging users. There will be an uneven distribution of quality amongst those prototypes. So there'll be 3 or 4, 5 or 6 obvious products to go ahead with. At this point, you engage that person who sent in the prototype, and you say, we're going to build your product, and you're going to get a royalty for it, because that's why we're encouraging and how we're encouraging these people to submit prototypes. At that point, we go into a fairly normal game design process, like King do. You put 2 or 3 people on the product, they create a full game design and a plan. Then I think, you could probably build these products with work-for-hire studios, because the hard work of finding the fun has already been done for you, and it's more a process of kind of manufacturing the product in the way that the movie industry would move from a script directly into production. Obviously, you'd have a soft launch or beta that enabled you to tweak the product, and then you go to full launch. So here's a theoretical company which takes advantage of the extremely low cost of failing and the continued trajectory towards the lower cost of failing. A company that could potentially create the next Candy Crush saga, but who would do so by only spending $2,000 to $3,000 on each prototype. So in conclusion, most games really aren't a success. There's a very uneven distribution of success in this industry. And this failure starts with a rather instantaneous gut reaction from consumers to a specific core mechanic. And the cost of simulating that reaction used to be really high. You'd rely on an executive, or you'd try and run play tests, or you'd try and combine all of these ways of simulating an audience together. But it's getting cheaper all the time, and people aren't taking advantage of that price. And even the most modern companies, the people that we think of being very forward-looking, still are spending, I believe, too much money on getting to that fail point. And I think there's an opportunity for $1 billion business with less than 20 full-time staff in the games industry. Thanks very much for your time.